All right, everyone. Thank you for making it out to this talk that I have here on how I got into the games industry. My name is Peter Bourgeois. Some of you might know me by my old artist name, Arjuna Gonzalez. I'm a tech artist at Ubisoft Montreal, where I work on VFX for Rainbow Six Siege. I was the co-organizer of this meetup before then, and Brian suggested that it would be good to have some folks come in and talk about how they got into the games industry, if they got into it recently, and I got in fairly recently, about 5 years ago. So in this talk, I'm going to cover a little bit more of my work and education experience than you might think, because I think it helps to be kind of honest and upfront about what I had going for me before I ever tried to enter the industry. I'm going to talk about what it was like getting into it, and then go over a bunch of different lessons that I learned in the process for those of you trying to enter it. And so first off, I just want to get some disclaimers out of the way. The first is survivorship bias, which is just the psychological tendency of some people to focus more on success stories rather than the failures, even when the failures can have important cautionary tales that can be of equal or greater value than the success stories. By definition, you're not going to hear about a mistake that I made that was so bad I couldn't recover from it because I never made those mistakes. The second is having an MIT electrical engineering grad as your homeschool STEM subject teacher K through 12 privilege. I'm going to unpack what that means in the next couple of slides. And finally, Big Lebowski reference, it's mandatory, right? This is just like my opinion, man. It's not necessarily that of my employer, and your French vocabulary word of the day is divertissement, which is entertainment. So our story begins in a semi-finished basement in East Lebanon, Maine, just outside of Sanford. And for those of you who might be watching on YouTube and don't know southern Maine geography, it's about an hour, 20 minutes north of Boston. And this is from a recreation of this house that I lived in between the ages of 7 and 18 that I made in the Doom engine a few years ago. And this area doubled as both my mom's home office and my school area. So every day when I would have math class, I would sit down in front of this whiteboard and learn about some new mathematical concept like the natural logarithm problem that you see up here on the whiteboard. And I had a class size of 1. So I was able to get most of the help, all of the help that I would need in subjects like math. And it was taught by somebody who was in the first large group of women who graduated from MIT in 1970. And all through the 70s, 80s, 90s, did work in laser design and then medical applications of lasers. And by around this time, 1998 to the early 2000s, she was starting a biotech startup with a friend of hers who had a medicine background from Harvard. And what they were trying to do at the biotech startup was basically mitochondrial regeneration. If you've heard the meme that the mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell, well, what they were trying to do was, because the mitochondria kind of run out of juice as you age, they were looking to figure out how to recharge them and effectively reverse the aging process. Now, to do the experiments that they needed to do, they needed some equipment that you wouldn't necessarily find in a standard high school science lab, like a centrifuge or a laminar flow cabinet, which uses some circulated air to blow any potential contaminants up the little output pipe in the middle of the picture that I have there. Or a reverse osmosis water filter so that you get some very pure water samples that don't get any weird bacteria in them. And so when I would have high school biology class and in these kind of group classes with other kids from different homeschooling families, I would be able to do things like transfer genes from one species of bacteria to another and create glow-in-the-dark bacteria. So I had this like above average STEM education. Now, with all of that said, my mom didn't really know much about art. But what she did find was this collection of little art booklets by a guy named Bruce McIntyre, who was an animator on Pinocchio, Dumbo, Fantasia, a lot of those really classic Disney movies from the 30s and 40s that really laid down a lot of the also talked about Disney animation principles. And so she got me some of these booklets. I think I worked through drawing textbook, drawing in 3 dimensions, art elements, and most of flowers and trees. And up to this point, grading in homeschool for me had been a matter of you either go back and fix the mistakes you've made or you're not done yet. But with these books, the fact is I was working through the drawing exercises faster than my mom could keep up with them. So at a certain point, she just decided, let him cook. And so I was basically teaching myself to draw. And what happened was I was starting to develop this habit of self-teaching, and, what it looks like and how to do it right and what to watch out for that would start to become fairly important. And another idea that I got out of these books that would be important later was in Drawing in Three Dimensions, and I think the drawing textbook book, Bruce makes a point to discuss how a three-dimensional object is supposed to look when you're looking at it on a two-dimensional surface. Put a pin in that. It's going to become important later. Now, so this all happened around middle school. And then when high school came along, I developed an interest in coding. And first I learned HTML to make basic websites, and then I moved to QBasic, which is a much older version of Visual Basic. And then I wound up with C. And that's why this is called the C years, because it's the years when I learned to program in C. And I did get a good ways with it for a high school kid in the early 2000s. I started working on this ASCII graphics RPG, but I never really got super far with it, mostly because, I was a lot less outgoing back then than I am now. Back in this day, there's no such thing as social media, at least as we know it. I was the only kid in my IRL friends group who had any interest in computer programming. And, there were web forums, but that was about my only means of getting in touch with other people who were into games development. And that's why I'm so glad that MVGD not just exists, but is continuing on after me. Because, if this group existed in 2002, I really do think I could have done a lot more with it than I did back then. But it's also true that another factor at the time is I was getting more and more interested in state and local politics towards 2004. And so I kind of let it all fall by the wayside. But by the end of these years, I had a habit of self-teaching. I wasn't intimidated at the idea of teaching myself something new and getting the books and hitting them. I had some grasp of art fundamentals, and I knew how to code. Excuse me. Now, I don't really have a good transition to this next slide, so I'm going to just click the button, and whoosh, we're off to 2011 to 2017, the KG years. And I call it that because this is when I studied abroad in Kyrgyzstan, which is this beautiful, mountainous ex-Soviet country just west of China that you should absolutely visit if you ever get the chance. And so during this time, I had already earned my first bachelor's in political science from Maine. I got my second bachelor's in computer science from UMass. And through a series of strategically picked study abroad trips and internships, I managed to start a career in international human rights advocacy around issues of internet censorship, electronic surveillance, privacy, encryption, net neutrality, mostly in ex-Soviet countries, but a little bit around the world as well. And, those years brought me real-world work experience in a white-collar job and some hands-on experience with the office politics that comes with it. I had a solid CS background with the second bachelor's. You can self-teach a lot of what's in your typical undergraduate computer science curriculum, but you're going to end up with gaps, and I didn't have those gaps. Next, international human rights is an extremely difficult industry to get into, especially if you're coming from a state school that doesn't have the best study abroad or international affairs reputation. When it came to getting the study abroad experience that I needed, UMass was not really able to help me very much. I kind of had to blaze my own trail and compete with people from places like Johns Hopkins, for example, or Georgetown, or Columbia. But despite the conventional wisdom, I got into that line of work. And so by 2017, when I was on my way out of it, I had this belief. That doesn't mean that it wasn't challenged now and then, but I had this belief that I've done this before and I can do it again. I can get into game dev if I'm smart enough about it and I work hard enough. And finally, I worked in a more stressful industry than game dev. There's a lot of talk about crunch and long hours in the games industry. I'm not attempting to diminish that, but what I am saying is that, I put in the hours I need to put in. I do my work well. But it's also true that, after you've worked at a place where you've had coworkers who have been arrested and tortured in countries that don't have particularly good human rights records for arguing for their basic fundamental human rights, it kind of helps put the stresses of a 40-hour-a-week or 50-hour-a-week job in their proper perspective. So you might be asking yourself, how do you get from international human rights stuff to game development? Those fields don't really seem to have a whole lot of overlap. Well, at the last organization that I worked for, one of the projects that they were working on was kind of a Telltale Games type game, a narrative-focused project around human rights abuses in a specific country. I don't really want to go into the details because it's largely outside of the scope of this talk, but what it boils down to is, as I was leaving the human rights sector, I taught myself Unity. And I was kind of lucky in that regard because towards the end of my CS degree at UMass, I did some mobile development in Android. And that event-driven programming paradigm in Android development does analogize itself very well to how components in Unity work. So I built my Unity skill set on top of my CS degree, and I was starting to learn 3D art as well. And the concepts that I picked up from Bruce McIntyre in middle school very much came in handy as I was trying to think about what it is I'm looking at in Blender and how to manipulate the geometry in the three-dimensional object from my two-dimensional flat perspective. You never really know what kind of knowledge you might have to brush the cobwebs off and reuse from 5, 10, 15 years ago. I got out of tutorial hell. The first significant project that I started on in what I call the Bug MVGD years. Bug is short for Boston Unity Group. May it rest in peace. And fortunately, the Boston Unity scene is starting to bounce back. But anyway, so I got out of tutorial hell. And if you don't know what tutorial hell is, it's a thing that can happen if you are learning some aspect of game development, largely from not super well-made tutorials, where it kind of becomes monkey see, monkey do, and you follow each step, but you come to the end of it without the best knowledge of how to apply what you learned to different related situations. And so, luckily, the first major project that I did during these years, if you've played the first Metal Gear Solid, you know that there's a VR training, quote-unquote, section where there's these little tutorial levels that explain the different aspects of the gameplay. Well, I recreated the VR training levels, not in VR, but in Unity with the first-person character controller. And then basically I basically re-engineered them with some of my own content, some of my own level designs. The idea being to communicate the same gameplay ideas, but just without something that copies the exact same without something that copies the exact same level layout from 1998. After this happened, I was very lucky to find a couple of good communities that create good devs. You may recognize this phrase from my going away talk 2 years ago. Maine Video Game Devs was definitely one of those communities. JP LeBreton's WOD Wednesday streams. So JP LeBreton is a level designer at Double Fine, and he worked on Psychonauts 2. And before that, he was at 2K Marin, where he was the lead level designer, I believe, on Bioshock 2. And before that, he was a level designer on Bioshock. And what he did for a couple of years was download randomly selected Doom levels from the id Games archive, the big web archive of custom Doom levels, and he would do a live stream commenting on their level design. And there was a little community that sprung up around that of cool and creative people who I got opportunities to collaborate with on these basically community Doom map sets that we created in 2018 and 2019. Which was a very fun opportunity to, work with some interesting people on some cool Doom levels. Nina Freeman's dev community. So Nina Freeman is also a level designer and I believe independent game developer. She worked on Tacoma, which was the sequel to Gone Home, which is an indie title that you may have heard about from a couple of years ago. She held a couple of game jams in her Discord, and I participated in them, and that was also a fun opportunity to collaborate with some people. And I did a bunch of other game jams outside of those communities. If you have not bookmarked itch.io/jams, it is your friend now. It's the best place, I think, on the internet to find a very large and active calendar of current and upcoming game jams, and you can just find the start and end dates and click them and go to their pages and find the rules and such. And, hanging out in all these communities, working on my skill set, making connections, put me eventually in the combination of right place, right time, and right skills to land my first indie gig. So that continued on for a couple of years until the end of 2020, when I decided, for reasons outside the scope of this talk, that I wanted to emigrate to Quebec. Now, without going into the gory details of the Canadian immigration system, the only way for me to make that happen would have been to land a job at a AAA video game company. No big deal, right? So this was, again, like I said, end of 2020 and all of 2021 and early 2022. During this time, I'm still working at the indie studio. I'm studying French. I'm keeping a close eye on Meetup just to see if there are any in-person meetups that are starting back up in Canada. I can't travel there until I think it was early 2022. They opened the border back up after it had been closed to non-essential travel. And I found a game jam in Sherbrooke, which is a small town about the size of Portland. I just referred to Portland as a small town. You know what I'm talking about. But yeah, I found this game jam in Sherbrooke in southeastern Quebec. It was about 2.5 hours drive from where I was, not counting time at the border crossing. And so I went and participated, and I had a chance to talk to the organizer of that game jam, and I told him, hey, I want to emigrate to Quebec. What are my options? And he said, well, I can send your CV to Ubisoft. So he sent my CV to Ubisoft. And that got referred, and the recruiter got back to me, and it took a little while before I got to my first interview with the people I would be working with. So in the meantime, I started doing these little side projects, excuse me, to just sort of demonstrate that I could easily pick up and use a lot of industry standard tools. So the first thing that you see here, this little texture ball on the left-hand side, that is from, so I got the idea for this around the time that Ubisoft Montréal took over development of the Prince of Persia: Sands of Time remake. And what I did was I found this fan-made tool that lets you extract bits of data from that exact original game. And so I found a trim sheet for textures for the old 2003 Prince of Persia: Sands of Time. And I had an idea of what would it look like if I made a 4K PBR remake of that trim sheet. And so I threw it together in Blender and ZBrush and Substance Designer and Marmoset Toolbag for the rendering. I think it was the first time I'd used ZBrush and the first time I'd used Marmoset Toolbag. Fortunately, I knew my Blender and my Substance Designer. And, I followed along working through an ArtStation learning tutorial taught by professionals in AAA. And that was an ArtStation post. And then just to the right of that, I call it the Quater Melon. It's a like little render that I put together in Houdini. And this was like one of the first non-trivial things that I made in Houdini. And those balls are moving in a script. Their movement is driven by a Vex script. Now, Vex is a scripting language in Houdini, and it uses a bunch of complicated-ish mathematical formulas involving like trigonometric movement and polar coordinates to get the specific movement. If you want, I can send you the video of the render on YouTube. So I had these things pretty much up on ArtStation when the recruiter sent me an email saying, hey, how are you at Autodesk Maya, 3ds Max, and Mobu? And I'm sitting there looking at it and going, what's Mobu? Quick Google. Oh, Motion Builder. It's the industry standard tool for motion capture data. Okay. How am I going to respond to this? So I sent back an email saying, like, I'm confident that I can pick up, these 3 Autodesk tools and, like, look at these things that I've already got in my ArtStation where I've shown I can pick up and make something with ZBrush and Houdini. And then just after sending that, I downloaded the 1-month free trial of Autodesk Maya Indie. And I already had a subscription to the Gnomon Workshop, which is this excellent resource for CG art, again, with like these sort of self-directed classes taught by professionals in VFX and film and games. And I found Master Rigging and Python Scripting in Maya by Nick Miller, who does rigging at Double Negative, which is a VFX and film studio in Vancouver. And I just gave myself a crash course in Python scripting for character rigs in Maya. And when my interview came around, I was asked, so how are you with Autodesk Maya? And I brought up what I guess I considered the most impressive script that I had, which I think had to deal with, adding constraints onto a character skeleton. And I just talked through the script and I explained that this was, from the class, but I talked through it explaining that I understood the concepts. And then when I got to the end, I talked about the little additions that I made, thinking through it, like just trying to speculate about like what additions to the script could be good to have in a production context. And then I asked at the end, any questions? And the person who would become my boss said, nope, you did your homework. And so that interview was, I think, on Thursday. It was a long weekend in Quebec, and I will never forget logging into my Gmail Monday afternoon and seeing the email that I would get sent an offer by the recruiters and nearly passing out in my chair from the positive shock. Fortunately, I didn't. But yeah, I accepted the offer, got my work permit, packed my bags, and moved to Montreal. Now, some of you might be asking yourselves, like, what does a typical day look like as a tech artist at Ubisoft? Well, I happen to have drawn up a quick cartoon for it, and I'm just going to click the button and then take a sip, and you can just have a quick look over it before I start talking again. And being that this is Maine video game devs, I figured I should give it a little bit of local flavor, what with the tech director and the artist. Now, a couple of things. First, every single character in this cartoon is 1000% in the right to have the concerns that they have. They wouldn't really be doing their jobs right if they didn't. Next, these concerns are inevitably going to end up in conflict, because what looks wicked beautiful all too often is not going to run at 60 frames per second on a PlayStation 4, or it's going to take up more memory than a PlayStation 4 has. And so what you have to do as a tech artist is help all of these different characters negotiate and compromise and look for weird workarounds or hacks that help them create the thing that they are trying to ship at the end of the day within the time and budget constraints that they have. You need to have some grasp of the art fundamentals so you understand what the artists are trying to pull off. You need to speak programmer, because programmers, bless their hearts, are sometimes just plain so deep in the weeds that some of their explanations might not necessarily make sense to the artists who don't necessarily have the technical background. And so all of this is to help contextualize my point that your ability to communicate clearly with folks from a wide variety of backgrounds is more important than any single hard skill that you can develop. You can be the greatest 3D modeler, for example, in the entire industry, but if nobody really likes to collaborate with you, or you just can't understand different technical constraints that you have to deal with on the project, people are not going to like to work with you. The same goes for what I call your chaos wrangling skill. Your ability to follow like a bunch of different conversations going on at once and figure out how to prioritize and plan your work around them, and decide like which particular fire you need to concentrate on putting out first, especially when, because these characters all have different concerns, they're not going to have the same sense of what the most urgent fire to put out is. For some more lessons learned, a route of tutorial hell that I would recommend if you're getting started is to clone level 1 or the first 20 minutes of gameplay of a game from the PlayStation 1, Nintendo 64, Sega Saturn generation, or a PC game probably made between like 1995 and 99. And then remake it with your own content. Like, you can use all sorts of ripped stuff that you absolutely don't have the rights to, just don't publish it. Or if you are going to publish it, make sure you've remade it with your own content and made it different enough that you're not getting yourself in trouble. And, you know, the old conventional wisdom around this subject is clone something from a much earlier generation of video games. You know, something from the late 70s, early 80s. Pong or Breakout or Space Invaders or Asteroids. And I do think that advice still has value. What I'm getting at with this bullet point is that Unity, Unreal, Godot, you know, your standard engines that you can just pick up and start learning, they do so much of the really difficult work of 3D for you and make it so much easier that I think, you know, if you have some of those super basic projects under your belt, this is in kind of a sweet spot where what you're building is more complicated than what any standard YouTube tutorial is going to show you. So you can, you know, experiment a little bit with stuff that you might not immediately know the answer to. But it's not so ambitious that you're at a serious risk of overscoping and then just giving up and not having anything to show for your time and effort. Next, it's not who you know, it's who you get to know. You know, the old saying in the entertainment industry that it's not what you know, it's who you know. Well, it's who you get to know. Like, you can make up for, you know, not coming into this with a ton of connections by networking, if you can network in a smart way. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means later. Find a community you vibe with and that does game jams. So those of you here in the MVGD server right now, congratulations, you have done that. But if you have the time and bandwidth to maybe hang out with and collaborate with folks in 2 or 3 Discords, that's probably a good number if you can. If you haven't read The Door Problem, that is your homework now. The Door Problem is a blog post from about 10 years ago that talks about all the different folks who can, all the different disciplines that can be involved in something as simple as adding a door to a video game. Which sounds simple to a layperson, but yeah, it's very easy to just have a whole giant crew have to do at least a little bit of work on something like setting up a door just to get it to function properly. And of course, in the indie space, that means you're working with a smaller number of people who have to wear that many more hats. Part 2 of lessons learned. You can learn the basics anywhere, then learn from the pros. Starting up Blender and figuring out like the difference between object mode and edit mode and like what the UV editor is. That is something you can learn from any good YouTube tutorial. There are certain things, though, that you are not going to be able to pick up unless you have professionals teaching you, and that, fortunately, is where there is a good number of various resources out there. ArtStation Learning, I've showed how that helped me in the past. Gnomon Workshop as well. There are a lot of professionals in AAA who are doing tutorials on Gumroad, too. I have worked through a few of those myself. There's also, a book called Game Programming Patterns. I don't remember the author of it, but I know he used to work at EA. So on the programming side, that may be a good place to start. Next, when game jamming, check in with the programmer to make sure you're not overwhelming them. Ideally, when you're game jamming, you should check in with every member to make sure they're not overwhelmed. But what I'm saying is that I've been involved in about 13, I think, game jams since 2017. And in every single one where we really did not have a lot to show for the time and effort that we put in, that is what went wrong. Either somebody else was the programmer or I was the programmer and I had too much on my plate. And I think part of the reason for that is, if I go back to my cartoon here, you remember, like I said, in a AAA context, each character here is going to be one person or like a group of people. But in an indie context, and especially in a game jam, your programmer might also be your tech artist and your tech director. And so they have like the added task of taking the assets that the art director and the artist put together and making sure they function properly in the game without tanking your frame rate or eating up all your memory. And that can be rough, especially for somebody who is just getting started in this domain. Have your business cards and your CV handy at any game dev event you go to. This isn't a commercial for Staples. I'm just saying, that they have a really good web app that makes it very easy to create a nice, professional-looking, affordable package of business cards. Or you could be more punk rock about it. I linked an Instagram reel here that talks about making a little zine out of an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. I mean, I know I've exchanged business cards with people and it's been kind of a, yeah, sure, whatever thing. But if somebody gave me a zine with like some original artwork that they hand drew and maybe like a QR code or something or a domain name to their portfolio, holy snap, I would hold on to that and it would be incredibly cool to get. I don't think I've ever had something like that happen. Generative AI is not coming for your job. I agree with the consensus that I think is emerging that, yes, there are a lot of legal and ethical issues associated with this. I'm not really here to address those. But as for the idea of like training machine learning models and using them to streamline various game development tasks that would have taken a lot of time or computing power otherwise, I think that's really where the industry is starting to go with this technology. And I think at the end of the day, you can't really take the human element out of it. And there's also some fairly good science to hint that there's some diminishing returns to what we're doing with AI here that is going to cause some really hard limits on its capabilities. And you can take a look at that link in the slides, which will be posted in the Discord for more information. Finally, I have 4 questions here that I think are good to ask if you are interviewing for a job at an indie studio. And, with some indie studios, the people who start them have lots of years of experience and they know what the best practices are and they implement them. Or if they don't know best practices going in, they do the homework to figure them out and implement them. In other indie studios, that is not the case. I'm not saying this to name names or to name and shame anybody. I'm just stating what I believe to be the case in the indie space right now. And so these questions are here to help you figure out, like, if you are interviewing at an indie studio, what type of studio are you dealing with? And I can say for me personally, I would require at least an okay answer to all of these questions. Excuse me. Before I would consider accepting an offer from them, unless I really needed the money. Granted, sometimes you just have to pay rent, but this is just what I think about them. And I'm going to give you some examples of an okay answer and a better answer where applicable. So first, what source control are you using? Source control is a pain in the butt. I love source control. I hate source control with the fury of 1,000 suns. In Unity and Unreal, out of the box source control integration, and by source control I'm referring to things like Git and Perforce, can be hit or miss, because often what happens is the engines generate and modify various metadata files that it can get a little tricky when you bring source control into that picture. But what it does allow you to do is it allows you to, break up the development into discrete steps called commits and Git. And because it's broken up into discrete steps, it gives you the opportunity to wind the proverbial clock back if your project goes sideways because of something that got submitted, which it will many times if you are making any kind of non-trivial game development project. So it's definitely a must for any game development, for any game of any size. And so an okay answer in my mind would be, yes, we use Git. A better answer would be, yes, we use Git and we have this or that plugin or this or that process or this or that tool associated with our engine so that our developers can do things like move files around or rename folders or, hijack is the term in Perforce, make a change that doesn't get immediately recorded in the source control and so that it blocks somebody else trying to make a change on the same file, and they can make draft changes without affecting anything. And so that all of these things can happen without causing much of a headache on the project. Next, what ticketing system do you use and how long have you been using it? Everybody in this Discord server, anybody who's going to watch this in the future, has a limited ability to plan and prioritize things, and they have a limited working memory. What a ticketing system like Jira or Trello or Codex is one that I've seen used in indies before, does, at its best, is externalize the working memory of everyone involved so that, if they get sick, if they leave the project, if they have a family emergency and have to step away for a bit, if they catch long COVID, there is a record there of what they were working on and how far along it got, so that they or somebody else who replaces them can come in and pick things back up. And how long have you been using it? Every game project is different. These tools need to be used a little bit differently for every project. It's a good barometer of how comfortable the team is with using it. So for me, an okay answer would be, yeah, we use Jira. A better answer would be, yeah, we use Jira and we use something like this Gitkraken plugin that I linked in the slides, where it integrates your source control with your ticketing system so that, Git commits can get tracked in the ticket system. And so you have a much... you have this detailed record of the work that gets done more or less by default. Next, will you send a 1099 or a W-2? The famous tax forms. I think that, once a game project is far enough along to have multiple people who are getting paid to do work on it, you've got a business, and I think that anybody who doesn't have the administrative or accounting capacity to send out these basic tax forms has no business running a business. And so there's only an okay answer to this question, and that's yes, we will send a 1099 or W-2 depending on whether you're a contractor or an employee. Finally, do you have a producer? keeping track of all of the work that goes on in game development and seeing if it's on schedule and, reacting accordingly if things seems to be moving off schedule, that is at least a full-time job in any game development project. And so you need somebody usually dedicated to working on that at the very least. So an okay answer would be, at the very least, like, we have somebody who is a producer and has some other role on the project as well. It's very context dependent. A better answer is definitely, yes, we have a producer, or maybe we have more than one producer. So that takes me to the end of my talk. In discussing like who the audience for this was with Brian and Adam, I understood that it would a significant chunk of them would be art students at Mika. So if those of you who are either here in the server or listening on YouTube are here, I'm a little older than you. I'm a millennial. I understand that you guys do not have some of the ideas that my generation had when we were graduating into the market and had beaten out of us in the Great Recession. Like, how tough the job market is. And you've probably heard other speakers talking on subject like this saying, most of you are going to fail, most of you are going to really struggle for a long time and whatnot. So I'm not going to repeat that because I imagine you probably know it. What I can say is that I wish you all the best of luck. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And yeah, I think I'm going to stop the presentation there.